And here we go. We are recording. Hello and welcome. We're here to talk about leaky gut. And I wanted to start with a brief rundown of how this became important to me, why I've put so many hours into researching it, and why I think it's important to share with as many people as I can. So the story for me starts at the beginning of this year, but in some ways it also goes back to when I was a kid, maybe longer ago than that. I've always had digestive issues. I thought of it to myself as I have a sensitive stomach, right? But the thing about that is I didn't really have the awareness within my body for a lot of my life to determine the difference between, do I have a problem in my stomach, or is it more affecting my small bowel or more so my large bowel? So, it was just something I was tolerating until February of this year. I had a period of roughly a month where I was experiencing nausea, inflammation, insomnia, brain fog, pain, bloating, to the point where I basically couldn't function. I couldn't get anything done. And I finally decided I can't ignore this anymore. So I went to some doctors. They gave me blood scans. They gave me a sonogram. And what they came back with was, the first bit of news was, you have fatty liver disease. And the second was, you are fat. And if you've been to the doctor before while being in an overweight state, you might know how that goes, right? And they say, like, deal with the being fat, and then we'll give more attention to your symptoms. So I found myself in that position, and I did lose weight. According to their advice, I did lose weight, but I also did my homework, right? Because I wanted to understand, are there connections between these symptoms I'm feeling and my weight and these issues with my liver? And that's where leaky gut came in. And that's what really brought the picture into focus for me. Because up to that point, I thought maybe there was an issue with my microbiome, or maybe there was some kind of intolerance to some kind of food I was regularly eating. But then once I made the connection that leaky gut was causing the problems with my liver, then I also honed in on the small intestine as being the source of those problems. And that required a very different approach, and not one that I hear talked about very much outside of, people who talk about SIBO. That turned out to be the thing that explained a lot of my symptoms and allowed me to come up with a treatment plan for myself that was more nuanced than, just lose weight. And that's what I want to tell you about now. So before we get into the presentation, just a little more context. When I had my tests done in April, there was a biomarker for fatty liver disease. I had high levels of something called ALT, and I had really bad LDL, which is bad cholesterol. When I retook those tests in November, the biomarkers for fatty liver disease had just about gone away because of some of the things I did that I'll be talking about in this presentation. My cholesterol was pretty much unchanged. So I think what I take away from that is I need to make further changes to my diet. But I always feel like you've got to deal with digestion first, because if you don't, it's a chain around your leg for anything you're trying to do, because it affects your clarity of thought and your emotional regulation. And it just makes it really hard to stick with any kind of big lifestyle change, right? So I feel like you get that first part working right, and then you can do just about anything. So with that in mind, let's get into the technical details. I'm sure that's what everybody wants. So what is leaky gut? So from the point of view of the medical establishment, leaky gut is not a diagnosis. So you wouldn't go to a doctor and they would say, congratulations, it's leaky gut. It's more so that they might say leaky gut might be a mechanism that explains why you're suffering from particular other problems. So what are those other problems? Well, they're always gonna be focused on the liver, and there's a very good anatomical reason for that, which is that if your gut is leaking, it's leaking into your blood. And if things are leaking into your blood from the gut, they're leaking into what's called the portal vein. And the first place the portal vein goes is the liver, because the liver is kind of the logistical clearinghouse for all of the nutrients that you digest. So if things are getting into your liver from your gut, they're going to cause problems there first. But the liver also lets a lot of things pass straight through it into the bloodstream. And that means that leaky gut can cause problems, not just in the liver, but also anywhere else in the body. Like non-local chronic inflammation is a very common thing that can happen. So naturally, leaky gut is exactly what it sounds like. The intestinal wall is too permeable. It lets things in too easily. And because of that, things get in either from your food or byproducts of what bacteria in your gut are doing to your food. Now, an important element is leaky gut is primarily a problem with the small intestine. And the reason being basically the large intestine has a very thick lining on it called the mucosa. And in the large intestine, the mucosa is a home for the good bacteria that help ferment the food that you can't digest. And that then gets filtered into the blood. And that also goes to the liver. The small intestine does have a mucosa as well, but it's not as thick. And part of the reason for that is that it doesn't need to be, because the small intestine is basically where you eat all of the stuff that's for you. Like you eat what's for you, the colon takes whatever's left over, the bacteria in it ferment it until you can consume a little bit more of it, and then it gets excreted. But that also means that the small intestine is a lot more vulnerable to problems because the lining there is thinner because it's not meant to house virtually any bacteria. And we'll get into that a little bit later as well. So when leaky gut happens, what's the stuff that gets in and causes problems? It can be different types of fats being where they're not supposed to be. It can be complex sugars. A very common class of things that cause problems are proteins and peptides. Peptides are basically the building blocks of proteins, and then the building blocks of peptides are amino acids. And amino acids are pretty much as basic as you can get. Like your body needs those. It breaks everything down into them, breaks proteins down into them because that's its like basic currency. But if it gets into the blood without being broken down, it basically is reacted to by your body kind of like, oh, this is stuff that like we might be using within the body to send signals between different cells. And now there's just a signal that, you know, nobody said because it came from your food, not from another cell. And that can mess up your signaling systems, your immune response, and it can even set you up for autoimmune disorders. So why care? Why care what leaky gut is? I think that's particularly a question if you don't have noticeable digestive problems. If you're riding high and doing well most of the time, you might not think this applies to you. But the fact is, leaky gut explains it has a potential hand in all sorts of problems that don't rise to the level of a clinical diagnosis that you wouldn't see your doctor about, or if you did, they'd say, you know, lose weight, drink water, exercise, and that'll clear it up. So restoring the health or maintaining the health of your small intestine is important. Even if you're not dealing with something really debilitating. And the second reason, which is more specific to sufferers, is that SIBO, leaky gut, and fatty liver disease interact, and they create a cycle of positive reinforcement. And it's important to have an awareness of that in order to determine how to break that cycle. So why the small intestine, and why aren't we talking about the large intestine so much? Well, one of the reasons I already got into, the large intestine has the mucosa. The small intestine has very little of that. The large intestine has things that are difficult for the body to absorb and difficult for bacteria to break down, whereas the small intestine has things that are easy for bacteria to break down. They're easy for bacteria to break down, but the body doesn't want bacteria breaking them down because the body wants to break them down with digestive enzymes and just absorb them right away. The large intestine absorbs the byproducts of the microbiome, whereas the small intestine actively breaks things down and absorbs them. The small intestine has a fair amount of oxygen, which is something that the large intestine lacks. The large intestine has less oxygen because it houses bacteria that don't do well in the presence of oxygen, but serve us well for that specific purpose of fermenting things. And again, in the category of digestive agents, the small intestine is home to bile acids, which are things that are emitted in order to emulsify fats. Because you think, like, when you're washing dishes, right, it's really difficult to get fat to go anywhere. It just adheres to itself and to surfaces. So bile salts are like a detergent that breaks them up and clumps them so the body can surround them and absorb them. But what it does to fats, it also does to cells, because cell walls are made of fat. So because of that, the small intestine is generally a very dangerous place for microbiota, whereas the large intestine has very little bile acid, pretty much ever. I think the rule of thumb is like 95% of bile acid gets reabsorbed in the small intestine, and only 5% of it goes into the large intestine to, do other important things. Like, it's not really related to the talk, but actually that 5% is pretty important for microbiome metabolism and going back to support the body. And finally, when the colon is healthy, it provides anchors for friendly bacteria to live, set up colonies, set up biofilms, which are basically like sort of a protective union for bacteria, whereas the small intestine emphatically fights the formation of biofilms. Although in a healthy individual, it will still have some, but very few, and it's actively disrupting them. So we've established the main reason why the small intestine needs to protect itself from bacteria. And that's basically, there's lots of good food in there that the bacteria would love to eat. But digestion, like the scheme of digestion, is for bacteria to eat the things that are hard to digest, and the human body to absorb the things that are easy to digest. So having bacteria in the small intestine interferes with that in so many ways, and it creates byproducts that can be dangerous to health. But the small intestine doesn't just trust the bacteria not to set up shop there. So at this point, it's a good time to talk about the three terms. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about the small bowel? There's actually three bits to it. And the first one is the duodenum, which is where the small intestine receives, acid and food from the stomach. It's fairly small. It actually neutralizes the acid because, the stomach is specialized for withstanding acid. The rest of the body doesn't tolerate it as well as the stomach does. So it actually, the pancreas secretes bicarbonate, which is kind of like if you think of baking soda and hydrochloric acid, they'll react, they'll neutralize. And they'll produce CO2, not enough to give you gas, or maybe a bit of gas, I don't know, but definitely that's what happens in the duodenum. And then you have the jejunum. You can see why people don't talk about the small intestine very much, because these names are not very appealing. But the jejunum protects itself by having contractions. The jejunum is the longest section, so it needs to protect itself the most, and in some ways it's the most vulnerable part of the small intestine for that reason. But the contractions that move food along are much, much faster in the small intestine compared to the large intestine. So that is a big part of the defense. There's also a bit of alkalinity. So the pancreas doesn't stop at neutralizing the acid. It actually counteracts it a little bit. And then the lower, it's often called the distal. So when you hear distal, think downstream in digestion. So the downstream part of the small intestine is not neutral. It's somewhat alkaline. And that compares with, as soon as you get into the colon, it gets somewhat acidic again because of the fermentation that's happening there. So there's quite a gap in the pH level between the end of the small intestine and the start of the large intestine. So that creates a natural barrier as well. Then there's bile acid, as we already talked about. There's something called Peyer's patches. I may or may not be saying that right, but that's your body's active immune defense against bacteria. Like, no offense meant to Peyer's patches, but basically the only time you need to know about them is when they're doing their job wrong, which tends to mean, chronic inflammation because there's too much bacteria in your small intestine. Then the Peyer's patches get inflamed. But otherwise, they're kind of like customs agents or hall monitors. Like, do you have your pass to be in the small intestine, right? So then we get to the ileum, which is the most downstream part of the small intestine. There's lots more Peyer's patches there. It's also protected from the large intestine mechanically by something called the ileocecal valve, which just holds things back until it's time to open up and let a bolus of partly digested food to go into the large intestine. The rest of the time it's shut, and it's got a little kind of flap protecting it. So that has a pretty large effect. So when that valve isn't working, that alone can be enough to lead to digestive problems in the small intestine. The ileum, despite all that, does still have bacteria in it, and it has biofilms in it, even in people who don't have problems. So there was one study that said it ranges a lot between studies, but anywhere from 6 to 35% of healthy individuals have at least some biofilm formation in their ileum, which, does lead to the hypothesis, like, who says they're healthy, right? Healthy just means like they're not diagnosed with anything, they're not reporting anything. Like 6 to 35%, it could very well mean that actually they do have a problem. It's just not at a clinical level. But the caveat is I did look into it a bit, and it is possible for some friendly bacteria to colonize the ileum, and basically their job is to prevent bacteria, like other bacteria, from doing so that would be worse. So this is just some supplemental information to put things in perspective. So you have the combination of the stomach, the duodenum, and the jejunum. They have anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 bacteria per milliliter of fluid in them, which in relative terms is very little. It basically goes to show how heavily policed they are, chemically, mechanically, and by the immune system. The ileum jumps up a lot, right? 10 to the 8. So that's 100 million per milliliter. So way, way more. But then when you get to the colon, it's 10 to the 11. So it's 1,000 times yet more than that. So that gives you a sense of the order of magnitude, right? Like each time you jump up, the amount of bacteria in the previous stage looks insignificant. And this is for someone who isn't suffering from SIBO or something similar. I don't know what the numbers would be then, but they would look very different. And they could easily increase by a factor of 10 to 100, and you would definitely feel the effects of that. So the failure modes, like the body as a system, it gets stuck sometimes in modes that don't serve the organism. So how does the happy state, where the small intestine is protecting itself from problems, how does that give way to SIBO? Or something that might not be diagnosed as SIBO, but has a similar feature of things being in the small intestine that shouldn't be. Well, it could be food poisoning, right? It could be that you ate something that your digestive system couldn't kill. It was something stubborn, has no interest in cooperating with the body. It sets up shop wherever it wants. It sets up shop where the best food is in the small intestine, and it doesn't care about any of the defensive measures. So that is possible. It can also be a parasite invading upward from the colon into the ileum, or just, a commensal. So something you get along with in the colon goes up into the ileum, and it's like, hey, there's so much food here. This is great. And then it sets up shop, and then it becomes at odds with the immune system. And then you get inflammation and all sorts of other problems. So this is a little bit of original research from me. I was trying to work out, what my trigger foods were. And something I found early on was that, especially when I was in an especially bad state, fatty food was particularly bad. And I was curious why, because the bacteria don't really eat fat. Like, they don't find it easy to break down and use the fat that you eat. So why would that contribute to SIBO? And it seems like the reason is that the bacteria aren't eating the fat, but some bacteria do eat bile acid or bile salt, which is just a neutralized bile acid, right? They eat the bile salt themselves, which then means you lose in two ways. One, you're feeding bacteria you don't want to feed, and two, you're losing the ability to digest and absorb the fats yourself. So based on this, I started thinking, and this is what I'm calling the Constantinople model, and I'll explain why in a moment, but I started thinking, what if the progression of my problems started with eating a lot of fatty food? And because I was eating a lot of fatty food, I was producing a lot of bile salts. And the bile salts were getting to the ileum. Something from the cecum was climbing up and feeding on it. And then because of that, one of the defenses was removed, protecting the ileum from other things that would be destroyed by bile-tolerant bacteria. And then once enough of those that tolerate the bile salt get in there, they start producing acid, because most bacteria, when they ferment, they produce something acidic. I think there's a good chemical reason for that, but it's just a fact. But that acidity then neutralizes that defensive alkaline balance that the ileum has. And then, the ileum at that point becomes even more friendly to bacteria. So once you've neutralized the bile salts and the alkaline solution, at that point, the only defenses are, well, the immune system, of course, and the mechanical defense of the valve. So if that is failing, or that isn't working too well, just because of inflammation maybe, then it's a party. Everyone's invited. And at that point, you have full colonization of the small intestine. And, that's going to give anyone a bad time. Like, that's leaky gut, that's bloating, diarrhea, or constipation, as the case may be. And I call it the Constantinople model because I compare it to the siege of Constantinople, where the Ottomans besieged the city for many days, and it finally fell when some of the Byzantines who were out raiding failed to close one of the doors to the city when they came back. And this was noticed, and a large enough group of invaders came in to raise the flag on the gatehouse. And then a lot more of them came in, and then very shortly thereafter, the whole city fell. So that was the intuition. It felt like that might be how things got started for me. But it doesn't have to be anything like that. It could just be the valve not working. as I mentioned, that the valve alone can explain the whole problem. And then also, so the cecum being the gateway, like the very first part of the large bowel just before the colon, does a lot of fermenting. That's why it's so acidic. So it is true that anything that makes the colon have a healthier microbiome, it protects you from problems of the small intestine that start with parasites immigrating upstream. So that is a very important thing to manage. Like, it may or may not be the root cause, but it is quite important to prevent SIBO from recurring. And yeah, just a chance to emphasize this again. Bacteria do not have to be bad. They don't have to be, something that you would take a test to detect in your body in order to cause problems if they get into an environment in the small intestine where the immune system is compromised, the bile salts are compromised, it's not alkaline, and there's lots of easy nutrients from the food. And that can make SIBO hard to diagnose, and it can raise questions about where the boundary lies. Because a lot of people won't get diagnosed for SIBO medically, because the test for SIBO is a breath test, where they need to find particular gases coming up out of your small intestine after you've eaten. But yeah, that only makes some degree of sense, right? If the issue is actually something else. Like if the issue is a friendly, well-known bacteria. So I just wanted to acknowledge another aspect of leaky gut, which is the idea that's been put forward that you can get leaky gut not from bacteria, but just somehow, some other way, some kind of genetic problem or autoimmune disorder. And I'm mainly bringing that up just to say, I acknowledge that this exists, but I have very little perspective on it. I am somewhat skeptical of that area, but I am, looking to learn more. That's how this all started, is I'm just trying to learn as much as I can. But yeah, just to say, you can get leaky gut just from good bacteria that you won't be able to detect in a test getting into the wrong place. Also, that exact thing can cause chronic inflammation. And there's pretty much no theory about leaky gut that doesn't say inflammation is part of the reason. And also, if you're trying to treat leaky gut, it just happens that most of the things that treat leaky gut as an independent issue, the mechanism of those treatments is probably, or like plausibly at least, eubiotic, meaning it's actually trying to make your microbiome behave better. All right, let's get into the MMC, migratory motor complex. So this was something I learned about fairly late in the journey, but it was very, very important. So, part of my intuition, right, going back to when I didn't know what small bowel pain felt like. In my mind, how I'd been taught about digestion is the food goes through the stomach, gets broken down there, goes into the small intestine, most of it gets absorbed, goes into the large intestine, little bit more gets absorbed, and then it gets pooped out. There's a very important thing that I didn't learn about, which is like that makes it sound like it's an assembly line, a conveyor belt, right? Where things are just moving along and getting processed a little bit more at each step. But, well, actually, just like a real conveyor belt, it doesn't work like that. It works in batches. So the system moves forward, it stops for the processing to happen, then it moves forward some more. And this is mediated by contractions. So the state of those contractions and the timing is very important to your digestive health. And the MMC is at the heart of that, because the MMC is your maintenance system. It's a cleaning cycle that runs between meals, and especially while you're asleep. And its job is just flushing food residue that wasn't processed in the digestion itself, and just dead cells, because the small intestine sheds cells just like skin does. So those need to be flushed out or they'll cause problems. But the MMC doesn't start until your small intestine has been empty, and until it's been empty for a little while. I think something like half an hour to an hour is the minimum for it to start. And then if you eat, even before it reaches the small intestine, the MMC will stop, which basically implies that, you know, the small intestine is hearing, oh, we're going to have some work to do. Let's make sure we're not tied up before that gets started. Which means, you know, frequent snacking. And unfortunately, a lot of the advice about SIBO says eat small, frequent meals. And that is only part of the story. That advice can actually make your symptoms worse, because if you don't put enough of a gap between those snacks, it's going to inhibit your small intestine's ability to repair itself during the day, which is going to have a big impact. So that's a bummer that people are saying that. And then, of course, poor sleep inhibits it, because a lot of it happens while you're sleeping. Stress inhibits it because the parasympathetic nervous system activates it. And as most people have probably heard at this point, chronic stress in life just generally makes your parasympathetic nervous system less active, and that especially impacts digestion. So poor sleep, stress, and frequent snacking, those are all things that if you are able to eliminate or at least reduce them, your digestion will get better. Thankfully, there's also just things you can take. So we'll get into that later. Prokinetics make the MMC happen more powerfully. It basically upgrades and strengthens the contractions that push things through your small intestine. So let's talk a little bit about pinpointing the issue, because this is what I didn't understand for a really long time while I was trying to ignore my gut pain and just get on with my life as much as I could. So how do you figure out if you have problems, if you have like a stomach ache and maybe you have food poisoning or something, how do you figure out what part of your body is affected? So one way, probably in my opinion, the most reliable way, is with timing. So basically, if you don't eat for a day and a half, let's say 36 hours, and then that should be enough time to clear most things, maybe not completely out, but almost all the way. Then you eat some food. Do you notice changes in how you feel at certain time windows after you eat the food? So for me, this was actually a big issue for a long time, is that I would have pain and then I would eat some food to see if it was the right kind of food, because I was trying to figure out what my trigger foods were. And the issue is eating almost always made it feel better. And I think the reason is that it was just kind of insulating the inflamed part of my like gut lining. But in the long run, it was making it worse because it was interrupting the MMC. So, you know, if the food starts to impact it, whether to make it better or make it worse within minutes, then that's your stomach, right? If it's within 30 to 60 minutes, that's when gastric emptying will usually happen. So that's when the stomach is flushing into the duodenum. Then you start to get to the ileum within, 1 to 3 hours. So anywhere from like immediately after hitting the stomach to 2 hours after that. What am I saying? Proximal small bowel, 30 to 60 minutes. Distal small bowel. Right. So I guess it's more like half an hour to 2.5 hours transiting the small bowel. So then, yeah, if the pain starts up kind of somewhere in that range, like maybe, let's say 1.5 to 3 hours after eating, that's more likely to be specifically the end of the small bowel rather than the start. And then in the large bowel, it's hard to pinpoint because the nerves that sense pain there are a lot less specific. And yeah, timing helps, but not a whole lot because the range is huge. Because yeah, once food reaches the large bowel, it can spend up to 72 hours in there. Yeah, and if you're feeling pressure, so this was something I would have a lot. I would get pressure in my body. It wasn't like being gassy, even though it was gas. That's kind of the difference. Like if you're getting a lot of gas in your colon, it'll tend to empty out fairly quickly and you'll fart. But if you get it in your small intestine, it can be quite agonizing waiting for it to work its way out because it's narrower, and it's more folded up. So gas can more easily get stuck in there. Then there's also this thing about like if you try to localize the pain, something to be aware of is if you experience a pinch on your right side just above the waistline, you might think that's related to digestion, but it's more likely to be liver, and specifically fatty liver, because as the liver gets fat, as it inflames, it starts to press against the abdominal wall on the right side. So that's something to keep in mind because these symptoms often go together. And that brings me to fatty liver. So fatty liver very commonly goes hand in hand with SIBO. So the studies I was looking up gave me quite a range of answers, but basically patients with SIBO tend to be 4 to 5 times more likely to also be presenting with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So, fatty liver disease that doesn't seem to have alcohol consumption as the cause. And then I didn't put this here, but the reverse too is true. Like if you have fatty liver, you're about 2 times more likely to have SIBO than a member of the general population. And some people don't buy that leaky gut is the link between them. And those people tend to say, like, there's a third factor, which is obesity. So they're like, maybe it's insulin resistance that causes both things. But, I've had some blood tests this year. I have SIBO, I have fatty liver, I don't have insulin resistance. So this is going into some things we talked about already. The small intestine feeds nutrients directly to the liver. The liver is the first stop of processing. It's also the central hub for fat, which means that if the liver has problems, fat will just build up there waiting to be moved around the body. An interesting thing about fatty liver, though, is that there was a study done this year, like compiling a bunch of other studies that said fatty liver, if you correct for the things that cause fatty liver, like age, race, and lifestyle that like predispose you to it, and if you also correct for AST, which is basically the dangerous fatty liver, which is like cirrhosis, fibrosis of the liver, so that's where your liver is actually dying and falling apart. That's obviously deadly. I shouldn't laugh. Basically, if you correct for all of those things, fatty liver does not turn out to come with increased mortality. So fatty liver itself does not appear to be deadly. It's the things that cause fatty liver. And it's if fatty liver does progress to NASH, is steatohepatitis, or cirrhosis, that progression does make it deadly. But even if it's not more deadly, it like problems with the liver, because the liver is so important to your body's like energy processing, metabolism, right? The liver helps you break things down, distributes them in the body. Also, when it's time to break up fat and turn it into energy, the liver is very important to that. So if it's not working properly, that can lead to fatigue. It can inhibit your body's ability to repair itself. And that can lead to a loss of appetite, nausea, all sorts of other symptoms. So this is calling back to a little bit earlier. You've localized a symptom. Now, what does that actually mean? Now, if the symptom is in the upper small bowel, my estimation, and this is kind of based on intuition, is like it's more likely to be a transient issue. It's more likely to be food poisoning because it's difficult for bacteria to hang on in the duodenum. And it also raises the chance that it might not be a pathogen at all, but it might be an allergic response to something you ate or something physically lingering in your body. But also, so obviously dietary restrictions would help if it's an allergy. If it's a stomach issue, then something that increases your stomach acid will help address it. Note I said increase because, it's not on the slide, but there is a very common issue that somebody comes in for complaints with their small intestine, and they're prescribed, if I remember correctly, it's called a proton pump inhibitor. And proton pump inhibitors are basically advanced antacids. So really, it's more for addressing stomach issues. Like if you've got too much stomach acid, that can become irritating for your stomach, but too little stomach acid, and it's not going to be successfully sanitizing your food. And more bacteria are going to get into your small intestine that aren't supposed to be there. So for that reason, people who are prescribed proton pump inhibitors are much more likely to develop SIBO. So moving on to issues in the middle of the small bowel. Problems here indicate biofilms, a chronic inflammation issue. It's rare for problems to be just in the jejunum, because problems that make their way to the jejunum tend to have started in the ileum. But in either case, the big thing is motility, and like killing what's colonized it. But anything that improves motility will help to protect the jejunum. So we move on from there to the small bowel, the lower small bowel. And as we've said before, right? Disrupted ileocecal valve, the MMC not working as it should. It's a little understudied, but I do think something that can cause small bowel, like ileum problems, is if there's not enough alkalinity in that area, right? The Constantinople model, that like if that protective buffer of alkalinity is neutralized, then that might be part of the issue. And also, if the problem is in the ileum, there's a decent chance there's also a problem in the cecum, like down in the large intestine, because like that's where those bacteria would come from to begin with. All right, it's time for the most important part of this, which is talking about interventions. So if you have one of these issues, what can you do? And I have here a list. We're not going to cover all of these in great detail, but we're going to cover meal spacing, prokinetics. So this is both MMC related, right? Antimicrobials. So what can you do to help your immune system fight the bacteria? Alkaline support. So this is basically a treatment formulated around the Constantinople model. Electrolytes, fasting, exercise, probiotics, which are important in the broad scheme of things, but not as important as you might think for the small intestine. Fiber, and finally, acetate. So meal spacing. This is where you space out your meals. You want to give your MMC as much time as possible in between meals to clear out your small intestine. So that gives a disadvantage to anything that might be in there trying to hold on where it shouldn't be. A 1.5 to 2 hour gap between meals or snacks can be enough. But if you already have problems with motility, you're gonna want to give it more time. So I just use 4 hours to be like, that's got to be safe, because that is pretty much as long as the cycle can take, and a buffer on top of that. And in general, you might make exceptions to this sometimes, but you want to avoid, like, it's a timing thing, right? You want to avoid eating food so that it's coming in and interrupting the MMC or just regular digestion when the contractions have gotten almost to the end of the small intestine. Because basically I was looking into this, and the signaling that happens when your small intestine goes, oh, there's food, is actually twofold. It does create contractions too, but it creates a different kind of contraction. Creates a contraction where the upstream ileum does a bunch of contractions to basically be like, let's clear this food out of the way so the new food can come in. But then at the same time, it slows down the ileum. And this is a little unclear because it's like there's conflicting studies about it, but there would be a logic to that, which is basically you want to have the ileocecal valve open as little as possible. So that what that reflex is doing is just concentrating the food that you're eating so that it can all come out of the small intestine in one batch. But the issue with that is if the food's already at the ileum and new food is just being introduced to the small intestine, the food at the ileum is going to be waiting for a long time, right in the danger zone for SIBO. So that means basically if you're going to eat and then you're going to eat again, it's better to just extend the meal, like wait no more than 15 minutes before eating something else. Like the worst amount of time to space it by is like right at the duration. Like eating something, eating nothing for an hour, and then eating something again. That's kind of the worst thing you can do as far as the MMC is concerned. So some people find a 4-hour gap a little long. I certainly do. So between meals, you have to avoid eating like anything with nutritional content, but you can drink water, drink tea, but avoid, guzzling water, because just the water expanding your stomach can send this signal as if you'd been eating food. Some small amount of calories might be acceptable. You have to kind of work it out for yourself. Like if you have some sugar in your coffee, that I think probably fine, but no one can really answer that but you. It's helpful to pay attention to when things are moving, because the stomach rumbling is actually a sign that your migratory motor complex is working, which is kind of a timing issue, right? Because when the stomach is rumbling, you don't want to start eating exactly then, because it's happening while the MMC is happening, which is a kind of violent set of contractions in a particular phase. And that tends to last a couple of minutes. So if you wait 10 minutes after your stomach rumbling before you eat again, that is, better. And I think better for everyone. It's like meal spacing is something you can do even if you don't have SIBO, and you will probably still see some benefits. Prokinetics. So this is a really important one. This might be the most important slide in the whole damn talk. Right. So as we talked about before, prokinetics boost digestion. They make the MMC do its work with more gusto. They just help wake up these muscles. Some of the things that belong in this category that are fairly easy to access include ginger, mint, licorice, something called gentian root, and artichoke leaf extract. So artichoke leaf extract you can get as a pill. All of the others you can get as teas, which is a very convenient way to get to consume them, because then you're also getting water, which is just, good. Stay hydrated, keep your stomach occupied without inhibiting your system, and strengthen your digestion. And ginger and mint are dirt cheap, right? So it's very easy to integrate these. And then also, if you think that you are like a case where you really need something more powerful, there are also prescription drugs that do the same thing, but more intensely. Timing is important. It's good to take, like if you're taking it as tea, it's best to have it with the meal that you want to help along. If you're taking it as a pill, it's usually better to take it before the meal so that it can start to have its impact, as the food is arriving rather than just after. It's good to mention here that laxatives help too, but it depends on how they function. So caffeine is kind of a laxative because it's a stimulant that affects the intestinal muscles. So that includes things I'm mentioning here. So caffeine, nicotine. I actually use like Nicorette. I've never smoked, but I do use the pills. Capsaicin. For a long time, capsaicin was my go-to. I would like take a Carolina Reaper hot sauce and put it in a shot glass and drink it down, because it worked really well, better than you would think for resolving gut issues. And then magnesium, because magnesium is an electrolyte that muscles need. to operate. Magnesium works very well. It can work a little too well if you overdo it. But laxatives that work by retaining water, which is like a generic off-the-shelf laxative like X-Lax or something, that's more going to help clear the colon. Because basically how it works is if you increase the water levels in your small intestine, that's not going to change much, because the small intestine is usually already where there's a lot of water. Because, you know, if you drink a glass of water, it spends very little time in your stomach, and it's not absorbed in your stomach. It goes into your small intestine and it gets absorbed there. So the small intestine is used to, like, its contraction cycle is optimized for getting wet things like brought down. But it's the thing that prevents it from getting out of the small intestine is the ileocecal valve. So there's a valve in the way. It's not contractions. So that means, you know, if you want to clear your colon out, standard issue laxatives work great, but it's not the go-to if you're trying to improve the clearing rate for your small intestine, which is what you want to do if you have SIBO or like SIBO adjacent. Antimicrobials. So these are just things that, you know, you can eat. They're not, they kill things, but they tend to kill things selectively. They don't tend to kill things that are well anchored into your colon, the things that you really want to be there. Yeah, they're not too harsh on your system. They're Lindy, which means, like, you know, in every culture for thousands of years, people have been preparing food with dietary antimicrobials to help preserve it and promote health. So it's hard to go wrong with these. Like, you know, don't take an approach that's too extreme, but, you know, just incorporating these things into every meal is a good idea. So this includes things like garlic, spicy peppers, ginger, lemon rind. That's kind of an off the out of left field one, but if you take a lemon, slice it up and then freeze it, then take it out again, put it in a blender and make a smoothie with it, you can drink it, because like the stuff that makes the rind hard to eat breaks down, and then the rind itself has lots of natural defense mechanisms against microbes in there. So that is a really good one and very tasty. Like, you make a delicious smoothie with that. Cloves, turmeric, cinnamon. So those are a little bit less commonly used, but I think everybody knows turmeric, right? And yeah, cloves are used for medicine as well. If you are looking to do an intervention, you know, because some people are just looking for, like, what's a healthier lifestyle? And other people are like, I have a problem, I want to kill it dead. Then there are things that you can take in the second category that you may still be able to take them without destroying the good bacteria in your large bowel. So cinnamon has cinnamaldehyde, which can be taken as a pill. Turmeric has curcumin. Coconut oil, I didn't mention this, has monolaurin. The reason I didn't mention it is that monolaurin, while powerful, just doesn't exist in an active dose in coconut oil. Like, you basically need to concentrate it 1,000 times before it has an effect that you can actually use. So monolaurin is a bit expensive, but there's studies that suggest that it's particularly good at, you know, killing bacteria you don't want to be there, while leaving aside, you know, stuff that's sort of more lodged in the mucosa in your colon. Also, oregano oil. I would never advise drinking oregano oil straight. People use it, you know, you inhale it, get the fumes into your sinuses, and it can be really helpful for dealing with a cold. But if you want to use it for your small intestine, you can put it in a capsule. So I just use like a standard, you know, gel capsule. An enteric coated capsule would probably be better, but I find they both work. But yeah, the effect of that is pretty intense. So I would say, you know, don't take that every day, partly because it's expensive, but mostly because it's fairly harsh. But it does work if your goal is to, like, shake things up in your small intestine. Another one that I don't hear talked about much in the context of SIBO is NAC, N-A-C, N-acetyl-L-cysteine. That is a supplement that people sometimes take to head off cold and flu, but one of its big strengths is that it's a biofilm disruptor. So, if you have a chronic issue in your small intestine, even fairly strong antibiotics might not do all that much because biofilms work quite well. They're good at what they do. So medications that specifically focus on disrupting biofilms are a good thing to take if you want to stop things from colonizing, particularly in your small intestine. And there's a couple of reasons this works reasonably well at selectively targeting the small intestine, which is basically that you take this pill, it gets absorbed and it diffuses into the fluid in your small intestine. It disrupts the biofilms of things that are colonizing there. Then by the time it gets to the large intestine, it's mixed with everything else. It's reacted, it's kind of neutral. So it's not going to have as big an effect in the large bowel. And then on top of that, the good bacteria are, they're inside the mucosa, like they're inside that thick layer in the large intestine. So they're probably going to be preserved by any of the stuff that I've put on this list. And here's a tip about pills. If you want to take a pill and have it have its highest effectiveness in the small intestine, rather than being absorbed in the small intestine and digested, then it's better to take it on an empty stomach, because I have heard from some sources that if a pill passes through the stomach without any other food, without any actual food, the stomach kind of doesn't recognize it as food, so it doesn't emit stomach acid to break it down, which then means that it can reach the small intestine unhindered, and then the small intestine breaks it down enough that it opens, and then it delivers its effect. So I use that with, oregano oil, baking soda, which I'll talk about later, and hot sauce, which I'll also talk about later. So talk about later, talk about now. Alkaline support. So this is the idea that you could do a kind of short-term intervention with your ileum. If your ileum is too neutral, you take a combination of things and like foods and lifestyle habits to make that area of the small intestine more alkaline. And effectively, by doing that, in theory, you close the door to certain things that that your ileum would normally be able to defend itself against. And part of the logic of that is it's already a little bit alkaline. You don't want to make it dangerously alkaline, obviously. You'll notice pretty soon if you're causing serious damage that way. But just a little boost combined with antimicrobials and biofilm disruptors might be enough to break the cycle and help you restore your small bowel. So part of this is a diet. There's already a whole school of dietary pseudoscience about alkaline food. This is basically the theory that you want your body to be more alkaline and less acidic for your health in order to help your body manage its pH, which is not really true because your body can manage that itself. It can do the conversions. If it's too acidic, it'll produce things to neutralize that. So in that sense, it's not really true, but in the sense that we're talking about here, it's exactly spot on, because what you're looking for is things that produce an alkaline leftover substance once they've been digested in the small intestine. So if you eat things that have alkaline leftovers, that's what will build up in the ileum and help support it being more alkaline. So basically, you just scrap all of the justifications from the alkaline diet, but then you do the same things. What are the things that'll make that area more alkaline? And it's exactly the same things that are recommended by the diet, which is specific fruits and vegetables, fruits and vegetables in general, but there's specific ones that are better than others. Dark leafy greens are a major one. and then avoiding things that leave behind acid. So, bread, cheese, meat. And then also just if you eat less, your body will produce less stomach acid. And if you chew your food well, your body won't, like the stomach won't produce as much acid to digest it. So both of these would then help make the ileum more alkaline. And then what I referenced earlier, you can actually take baking soda. If you buy like type 00 capsules and fill them half full, that's like 50 milligrams of baking soda. So baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. And sodium is obviously fine, it's in salt. Bicarbonate is what your pancreas would be putting into your small bowel already. So baking soda is not something to be afraid of in reasonable doses. I was actually a little bit worried because like sometimes I was consuming like 200 milligrams and thinking like, whoa, is this too much? So I looked at a study seeing if anybody else was doing it, and nobody was doing it for like SIBO, for like small intestine support. But some people were doing it for in advance of high intensity exercise, because that causes acidosis. You get a bunch of acid in your blood. And if you take a buffer of baking soda just before, it can improve your performance. But it turned out what they were taking was like 300 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So we're talking like 30 pills of this size of baking soda. So at that point, I was like, I can be a lot less worried about what I'm doing, because they're doing it for a different reason, but I would have thought that was absolutely insane. Anyway, this one's a bit experimental, right? Like your mileage may vary. As I said, I haven't heard of anyone else doing this for SIBO. It is part of the thing that worked for me. Like it got me out of the really bad state. So, I do recommend it. I do recommend trying it and, start cautiously, because there can be side effects. The most obvious one being like it could produce more gas. But the best time to take it is probably about 90 minutes after eating. So the idea is at that time, that would be roughly possibly when the food has arrived at the ileum. So it's when the unwanted fermentation is at its peak, but it's also when all of the acid has already been secreted. So if you take it then, it won't interfere with digestion, but it will probably reach the ileum having dissolved and then help protect it with an alkaline buffer from the pathogenic environment further down. And if you do try that, I recommend also drinking lots of water just around when you do that, because it's dehydrating for sure. And yeah, I don't recommend this as a long-term habit, just as an intervention. Electrolytes. Yeah, because one of the big symptoms of fatty liver disease and like leaky gut is nutrient malabsorption, kind of ironically, but it's like if you have inflammation, things are getting through that shouldn't, but also the active transport is messed up. So like your body digests a lot of things, or like absorbs a lot of things by actively kind of grabbing them from the fluid in the small intestine and transporting them over. But during inflammation, that doesn't work as well. So it's a good idea to take electrolytes to compensate for that, because then you're giving your liver a better chance of absorbing those minerals, which in turn helps your body do everything, including digestion. So, it's good to take electrolytes. Pedialyte, which is usually for babies with diarrhea, is a very good option because it just has a good range of electrolytes to replenish the body. But another thing that I often do is like just a liter of water plus small amounts of, lemon juice for citrate, vinegar for acetate, baking soda for carbonate and sodium, and then salt for sodium and chloride. But if you do that, then you still need to get the magnesium and the potassium from somewhere. So like, chocolate and bananas. Exercise. So yeah, I'm not talking about this too much, but promoting blood flow is good for digestion. It's obviously not recommended to do intense exercise while you're digesting, but just like before and after. There's a bit of a small tangent I'd like to do here that just came up while I was thinking about this content, which is when it comes to the body's natural rhythms, when you think about digestion, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, something to keep in mind in a broader picture of like what other animals do when it comes to digestion is like they're not digesting food while they're running from predators. They're also not digesting food while they're hibernating. So they will have a period where they're eating a lot of food, but then it gets cold and dark, and then there's not a lot of food. Then they hibernate. Everything slows down, including the digestive system. So then think what's unique about humans, the human condition. It's basically that we can be in a hibernating-like state, but still have lots of access to food. And as it turns out, this is very dangerous. And I have a theory I'm building evidence for that this can explain a lot of the metabolic problems we have, is that we alone experience this perfect storm of having triggers for hibernation, like, depression, inflammation, illness, possibly reactions to our food, but we still are able to eat. And because we're hungry, we do eat. But our bodies are not prepared for it because we're in a hibernating state where we're not expecting, like the body doesn't expect to be eating a lot of food, and especially a lot of nutrient-rich food. So all of that to say, exercise is a way to kind of send a signal back to your hormonal system that says, actually, it's not time to hibernate, it's time to act. And by waking up your body for exercise, by the same token, it also wakes up your digestive system as you're resting and recovering from that exercise. So I do think exercise is very important to restoring your gut health. At the same time, gut problems make it harder to exercise. Unfortunately, it's just the way it is. In particular, if you have small intestine issues, that often goes along with gas, and gas that doesn't easily clear, so you get that sensation of pressure and bloating. And that's why I recommend, if you do squats are the ones that help massage the intestine, but also, by the same token, they cause harm. They cause pain if there's already pressure building up there. But because of that, if you do like just the minimum number of squats every day and pay attention to what it feels like, this can be a feedback loop to say, like, how much attention do I need to be paying to my digestion right now? Because if it's hard to do squats because of the discomfort in the small intestine, that means there's an active issue going on. So yeah, that's why I do lots of squats, just like to monitor things, but also to encourage the gut to move along so it doesn't get to that point to begin with. Probiotics. So I've saved this for very close to the end. It's a fairly major topic, which, when I was researching this like 6 months ago, I was already thinking I'd like to present this. But I would have thought it would involve probiotics a lot more than it did. But this is basically the reason that leaky gut, small intestine problems are mostly not fixed by probiotics, because, in the worst state where you have chronic inflammation, your immune system's not working, probiotics will directly make it worse, because those good bacteria will come join the party in the small intestine. And you don't want that party. You want them to go home. If you're not in that acute state, then probiotics will hide in the the lump of food coming in from the stomach. They'll pass through undamaged by the immune system. They'll join the microbiome and the legal happy party in the large intestine, and there they'll do all sorts of good things for you. Like they ferment your food, give you more nutrients that you can do things with. They support the motility of your colon, which is also important. So probiotics are good. I just don't recommend them if you're in an acute state of small intestine issues. Probiotics help to produce acetate, butyrate, and propionate. I don't have too much to add about that, but just to say that that's another case where if you have dysbiosis, it can be good to supplement what you can supplement in your diet. And yeah, lacto-fermented vegetables I like because it's a combination of, the right nutrients for your small intestine, as well as bacteria that support your large intestine. Fiber is very much the same thing because fiber is often talked about for its ability to support your microbiome. The issue is if you have acute SIBO, fiber is just adding more mass to the thing that your small intestine has to move along. So if your intestine is inflamed or weakened, fiber is going to be like very possibly the wrong thing. But soluble fiber, which is the kind that dissolves in water and forms a gel, can still be good to have with meals despite that danger because it reinforces the protective lining of the small intestine. And yeah, if you have acute SIBO and you're like gradually getting better, at a certain point, you're probably going to want to think more about fiber. Vinegar, so acetate, right? The very last bit. I'm mentioning this mostly just because I don't have a very strong reason to say that it's a good thing, but I just have found it to be very good at supporting my recovery. One of the reasons is, if you're taking baking soda pills, then if you also take vinegar at different times where it doesn't interfere with the baking soda, you are providing your body with the electrolytes that it needs to balance things out. So probably not a bad idea for that reason. Another reason is that it suppresses the appetite, and often a good approach, when intervening against SIBO is to simply eat less. And it can make things taste better without making them more dangerous, because vinegar doesn't really benefit the bacteria you're trying to fight. And because vinegar contains acetate, if you have dysbiosis of the colon, you might not be producing as much acetate as you normally would, and vinegar can supplement and replace that. And the reason that's good is because acetate has a special role in the liver. So it's theorized that, pre-modern cultures and yeah, just people living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, they ate so much more fiber than we do, and they probably ate less frequently, and they would survive between meals by fermenting that fiber in their colons, and the acetate is then what their liver would use. So acetate is an energy source for the liver when you're not eating. So it supports fasting. And yeah, I don't recommend ever drinking it concentrated, but even just half a teaspoon in like a jug of water, a 1 liter jug of water, generally it just kind of makes the water taste a little bit more perky. So I definitely recommend incorporating small, regular amounts of vinegar in your diet if you're trying to improve the state of your gut. So I didn't tell you there was going to be a poop slide, but I think it's important that there is one. This is something we have to talk about. So basically, indirectly, I've been talking about different ways of, getting different lines of evidence for how your digestion is doing without mentioning really the biggest one. Because if you're not having direct symptoms, but just your mood is a little low, and that's hard to quantify, it can be hard to know what the state of your digestion is in. But what you measure, you can improve. So pay attention to your poop. If it is not consistently 3 to 4 on the Bristol stool scale, which basically means 3 and 4 are the two stages where it's kind of more the ideal looking turd. It just sort of looks like you'd expect a turd to look. rather than a bunch of little blobs or diarrhea. There is room to improve. So it can look like that every time if your small intestine is functioning well, the microbiome in your colon is healthy and it's aligned with your food. And finally, if you're, eating the right food. Fiber is a very big part of that. I have heard reports that some people who go on the carnivore diet, which has no fiber, still don't, they still have good shits, basically. And that's surprising. And I'm somewhat at a loss to explain that, but I think it's worth mentioning that it tells you, it may be more important to simply be eating food that agrees with you digestively than it is to just add fiber. So it's probably a combination of the two. If you don't have a very good reason to go on the carnivore diet, I would recommend fiber. And then there is the smell as well. We don't like to smell our poop, and it's obvious why. But there is a very important piece of information there. If you think historically, right? Taking a shit used to be called making dirt. And nowadays that sounds a little bit like a euphemism, but I have a hunch that it really wasn't for people living 1,000 years ago. Much more fiber in their diets. And they, I think day to day, they experienced less chronic stress. Their digestive systems were in better shape. Fewer antibiotics, fewer foreign pathogens that they weren't adapted to. It's just a lot of things in their favor. And it is possible to get to a state where your bowel movements don't smell bad, which then also means that you don't mind smelling them. And when they smell the way that you wouldn't mind smelling them is basically when they smell like freshly turned earth. If you go into the forest with a spade, stick it in, pull up the earth, and take a whiff of that. It is possible for poop to smell like that consistently. And if it doesn't, there is room to improve. So these are, I put this forward as these are indexes if you're interested in actively managing your digestion. You really can't ignore poop. And then finally, end-to-end transit time. So this is another good thing to just be aware of over time is in general, how much time passes between eating something and pooping it out. And yeah, for most people, this ranges from 24 to 72 hours. Fairly convenient way to measure this is to drink a cup of beet juice and start a timer. And then when you see red in your poop and think you have to go to the hospital, that's just when you stop the timer. You're fine. And yeah, generally lower is better, but that may depend on your case. If you have a lot of diarrhea, you may be looking to increase your transit time rather than decrease it. Okay, so I'm going to cover this fairly briskly, but this is just random things that don't really fit into the paradigm, but for some reason they have helped me. They've helped my digestion. They've made me feel better. One of them was very random. I tried fermenting habanero with in salt water. So this is a way to ferment hot peppers. And when I ate them, I got this very profound sense of euphoria. 2 times, I distinctly remember eating them and then feeling elated and crying and thinking, is it possible that I could feel this way all the time? And I can't explain that. And nobody else can that I've seen. Maybe there's just something in the air where I live. But you may want to try that. Because as I mentioned too, capsaicin, which is in hot things, is pretty handy because it's antimicrobial and it also speeds up your digestion. So it's a very fruitful thing to incorporate into your diet. Sheng Sha Pu'er, that's just dry fermented black tea. So it's fermented for quite a long time. Very ancient traditional thing. It's theorized that part of the reason it helps with digestion is that the bacteria that are starting to slowly ferment the tea are producing enzymes that help break that down. And those enzymes also help break things down in your food. It's possible. I just know that when I consume this, it does make me feel better across the board. Succinic acid. So like a friend of mine gave me some succinate at one point. Basically, it's a metabolism booster. And I have found that it's also helpful as a mood booster. And just like anything that boosts metabolism discourages the liver from producing extra fat, which just seems to be a good thing from what I can reckon. Yeah, and as I mentioned, hot sauce in a capsule, specifically apple cider vinegar for the combination of probiotic vinegar, and it has some stuff in it. I wasn't really able to get a clear answer of why it seems to be so healthy, but yeah, for many years, this has been my go-to when I had any kind of issue. Glucose over fructose. This is again, or over fructose. This is again more specific to like if you're trying to lose weight or just slim down your liver. Fructose stimulates fat production in the liver, and glucose basically doesn't. So you can have the same calories, but have them in glucose instead of fructose, and it makes a big difference. Collagen. I've just noticed that protein seems to be safe for me, and that it helps me feel full. Raw carrot has always been something I've relied on when I'm not feeling well. And then finally, mushrooms. So Stephen Skolnick, who I was greatly inspired by because of the work that he's done about the microbiome and how it influences so many different health conditions. He said that if you have an issue that might be fungal in nature, and if you eat a lot of mushrooms, then as your large intestine is digesting the mushrooms, it will promote the growth of bacteria that are good at breaking down fungus tissue. And then, they will eat the mushroom tissue, but they will also eat the fungus in your bowel. So I thought that was clever. That was a good trick. And I have noticed as well that if I eat a lot of mushrooms, it does generally seem to promote my wellness, but it is more so a large bowel thing than a small bowel thing. Well, and we're just about at the end of our presentation now. I just thought I'd share something because I find a lot of people who have bowel issues, they get frustrated, particularly because of the symptoms that make it hard to, live your life. Just to find something reliable that they can eat so they don't starve to death. And this is something I'm mentioning because I'm relying on it a lot lately. If you shred some carrot and you take some sardines canned in water, add rice vinegar and salt, and then you can supplement it with lemon juice, dextrose, which is glucose in powder form, or collagen powder. Then that just becomes a dressing to dress the carrot with. Then you've got, fats, proteins, fibers, sugars. It's filling. It seems to be healthy across the board. It promotes an active metabolism. And it is easy to digest, mostly. So it's a good choice for caloric restriction. Seems to be very safe for me, and I think the components are such that it will be safe for a wide range of other people. So I encourage you to try this if you're having issues, and let me know how it works out for you. Okay, so now we're on to the general advice, zooming out. Good digestion leads to good digestion, but you can't rush it. So, when I was frustrated with these problems in the past, I would try things that were very aggressive. I'd be like, I'm going to eat 4 cloves of garlic and a cupful of apple cider vinegar or something like that. I'm just going to take these problems and kill them dead. Sometimes that worked a lot better than you would think, but the problem was everything just came back, and then I'd have to do it again, and it wouldn't work as well the second time. So this approach just is not sustainable. So this is why my advice is figure out how to get yourself out of the danger zone, which often relies on fasting. I didn't have a slide on fasting. I think I screwed that up, but basically fasting is an intervention that can be very effective at getting you out of the very worst state. And then once you're out of the very worst state, then it's not a matter of, making a change, like a dramatic change. It's more about building habits that prevent the problem from recurring. Yeah. And then, as I said, when you're focusing on the small intestine, probiotics are not the way to go. But then when the small intestine feels reliably stable, it is a good time to introduce probiotics, because now it's time to focus on the large bowel and preventing the underlying problem from recurring. So be patient. It's good to identify trigger foods, because you can develop an intolerance to foods because of issues in your small bowel. I think it's really obvious with all this context. It's really obvious why, right? Because you can, like the bacteria that get into your small intestine can digest the food that you would normally not have reacted to, but they can produce a byproduct that produces an immune response. And then, suddenly you're allergic to something you didn't think you were allergic to. And this process doesn't necessarily happen right away. So I would say if you experience some kind of sudden symptom, think back to what you ate over the last 36 hours, and very likely the culprit will be there. Yeah, so then, when you identify a trigger food, it's just a matter of figuring out how to cut that out of your diet, at least until, you restore your digestive health. And then you may be able to introduce it back. Break the habit of solving pain with food. So this might vary depending on your case, but for me, it was a big thing keeping me in the cycle of the fatty liver problems. Is I would be having some kind of stomach pain, and I would eat something, because the food pressing against the area of me that was hurting, I think mechanically it made it hurt less. But then as soon as it was past, it would hurt again. Basically, what I'm saying is finding the right thing to eat is important, but it's not directly medicinal. And thinking that it is likely to produce a habit that builds up problems, right? Because remember that frequent meals are not so good, because they prevent your small intestine from doing what it needs to do to repair itself. Learn to sense your body's signals. So we talked about how to do this in various ways. So, there's poop, there's bloating, pain, timing, and then just general like fatigue and mood, because very often changes in fatigue levels and mood have a close connection to what's going on in your digestive system. And then if things seem to be taking a turn for the worse, it's good to know what you can do about it ahead of time. So in my case, the things that have really been working robustly is like, if I think things are going wrong, I do things I wouldn't normally do, including I take a glass with some fiber and some ginger powder, and I stir that up with some water. It's very gross and not fun, but it does seem to prevent my body from digesting things badly. And then also the oregano oil together with the baking soda. That's basically what's been working for me the last couple of months. There's also, I'm wondering if I skipped past a slide. I did skip past a slide. I don't know if it's too important, but this is basically to say that SIBO causes lots of things that cause SIBO. And there's a psychological factor to it. One that I will highlight is SIBO slows down your gut. One thing this can cause is waking up at weirdly early times in the morning. And it took me so long to figure out that these were related. But basically, there's this kind of low-key bloating that doesn't quite register as pain or discomfort, just as an inability to sleep. And I would eat food at like 7 or 8 p.m., go to bed feeling fine, wake up at like 4, 5, 6 in the morning, and just couldn't go back to sleep. And if I made my last meal like 4 p.m. or something extreme like that, this stopped happening. So I was like, oh, well, now I know what's causing that. But yeah, insomnia is another one of those things that makes it hard to stick to a plan, which then leads back to SIBO. So it's all about breaking the cycle. And a lot of breaking the cycle is like make it as easy for yourself as possible to do the right thing. Like don't rely on yourself to persistently make the right decision. Like stock your house with the things that help. And have a plan, have a drill that you go through. That's it. So yeah, that took way longer than I thought it was going to, which is maybe predictable. But I'd like to thank you for listening, and everybody who finds this recording after the fact. I really appreciate your time as well. I've put some details here on the screen, just if you would like to support me with the work that I'm doing, or if you would like to talk to me about dietary issues, if you want to try an intervention similar to mine, just shoot me an email. That's it. Thanks. Stop recording.